talking about it again in mental health? Why do you think that we need to talk about it again? It gets complicated, right? Because we talk about consent and we talk about confidentiality. We get some conflicting ethics, basically, that go on when we start talking about legalities in mental health care. We look at protecting the individual client's rights, but then also how do we balance that with protecting them from harming themselves or harming others and things like that. So we do get into some definite legal issues and some ethical issues. We talk about mental health nursing specifically. Tell me, because it influences, what do you know? Where am I? Enid, tell me about deinstitutionalization. What do you know about that concept?
They're looking at me with puzzled expressions.
Okay, Stillwater, do you want to tell me, what do you know? Have you heard that term before? Do you know what that is?
Are you talking about when people are used to living in institutions for long-term and you have to prepare and get them used to living outside of that institution?
Right, it's kind of that same concept. And basically what happened is earlier, a lot of mental health care occurred in long-term institutions, basically. If people had mental health problems, they kind of went to places that were often kind of remote and they just lived there and stayed there. But there got to be some issues with that. And the reason it's an important concept is because it influences basically the ethics and the rules and regulations that govern the way we care for patients today. Because often a remote location for long periods of time, sometimes things happen that weren't really taking great care of clients, basically. So there were some ethical and moral issues to that system. It also got really expensive, basically, to take care of people in an inpatient setting for the rest of their lives, which was what was going on a lot. And also another thing that factored into the movement away from that is that psychiatric medicines got better. So we got better able to treat some of those conditions, and so some of those people were able to be stabilized and be functional for periods of time. So we kind of moved away from that to a system that we see more today, which is caring for people kind of closer to home, smaller community institutions, trying to care for them outside of inpatient settings, kind of giving them, the idea being to give them a better quality of life. Talk about, are there any complications that we've seen from that? Have you heard of any problems that maybe contributes to? One of them is homelessness. So what we found as we moved people out of those long-term care institutions is sometimes those people had trouble living and then maintaining work and job and feeding themselves and things like that. So what we find is a lot of the homeless population ends up being people who are actually mentally ill, people who aren't getting enough care, basically. And that's why they, not always, but in some cases, why they lose their home, lose their jobs, and different things like that. It also, your book, not that you need to know this for the test, but your book does an interesting conversation on page 31 about the interaction between mental health care and the legal authorities and legal systems, because another thing that happens is basically law enforcement ends up dealing with mental health care, and they're not necessarily well trained for that. So a lot of times we also find that prison populations, often a lot of people in prison, it's really because they have mental health issues that were not treated, and so they committed crimes or different things like that, or they encountered legal authorities for different things, really not totally based on criminal behavior, but because of an illness that they had. So just some kind of concepts to be thinking about as we talk about mental health here, we talk about the legal issues, is that a lot of the legal issues come from kind of that history. So what governs how we care for our clients? Like what rules and regulations, where do we get the rules and regulations that we use in mental health nursing? Stillwater. Who tells us how we can care for mental health clients?
Common law.
Okay, where do we get common law? Basically, yeah, we'll talk about different kinds of law, but where does it come from? I mean, there are different levels of regulations, basically. We have rights within the Constitution that are important to mental health nursing. State and local legislatures make laws that govern the way we take care of mental health clients. Our Board of Nursing governs the way we take care of mental health clients. To some extent, other like payment people who payers to some extent govern the way we care for our clients and whether we get reimbursed for that care or not. So just kind of that's where we kind of get all these ideas from. Let's talk about types of law then. So there are three types of law. The first one is the one you guys mentioned, common law. Does anybody know where common law comes from? Stillwater, since you guys brought it up, where do we get common law?
Is common law done by the state or just by your regular community? Or is it?
Yeah, you're on the right track because it's not like the big laws that get passed down to us. Common law actually comes from judicial decisions, so things that the court decides. So not necessarily a law, because there's a different type of law that comes through government agents, from the government specifically, from Congress and our state legislatures and all those things. But common law is something different. Common law is when somebody goes to court and a precedent is set by the decision itself, by the opinions that are written that accompany that decision, and those things start to influence the way that we care for clients as well. It's basically defined in your book as the body of evidence that's created by previous cases. There are advantages to common law in that common law kind of can flow and with more flexibility, basically. It takes a long time to change a law with state government or federal government, and obviously very difficult to change the Constitution, but judicial decision-making in common law can kind of adjust as society changes, basically, and so that's where we get some of those changes when they need to happen to make equal rights, specifically for mental health care. The idea of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, the idea of the clients having the right to refuse treatment even if they were involuntarily admitted, and the concept of duty to warn, which we'll talk about all those things a little bit later, those all came from common law. So there are some times when judicial decisions determine what we can and can't do with our clients in mental health nursing. Then the next one is statutory law. Ina, do you know where statutory law comes from?
Federal and state legislator.
Right, yeah. Statutory law is legislative law. So those are the laws that, like Congress, state Congress, federal Congress, your elected officials make for you. These laws are not particularly flexible. They have to be very strictly interpreted, and they're slow to change as society changes. The last one in that group then, the third one on your slide, is administrative law. Those are the laws that are developed by the agencies that have to implement statutory law and monitor your legal compliance. So basically, Congress is not going to make a law about every little circumstance for every little thing that we would encounter in the hospital. So our regulatory agencies are the ones who are responsible for basically taking those big laws and making them specific regulations that we follow and regulating our practice. Does anybody know an example of an administrative body in nursing? Who do we answer to as nurses? Right. We answer to our state boards of nursing, is the primary place that we think about. And then facilities are also going to answer to their accrediting bodies, like you will see when Joint Commission is coming, or different other accrediting bodies and things like that, because that's going to influence rules and regulations as well. And like I said, payment structures and kind of Medicare, Medicaid, places like that create regulations too that indicate. And sometimes we can violate those regulations without violating the law, but we also don't get paid. So, our facilities don't love that over time, long term, because eventually they can't take care of people if they can't stay solvent. So our practice is influenced by those, how do we get reimbursed as well. Okay, so some legal definitions to look at. And this may be a slide I edited a little bit. Okay, so look at that and kind of fix it so that it's easier for you to understand, because basically negligence is kind of the primary concept there, and those four pieces fall under the negligence. So, where are we at? Talk about what is negligence for nursing. It's personal, yeah. Right. Yeah, all of that, those concepts fall under. So basically what they're saying is, if you leave a patient, you're personally responsible for that person, and you fail to do what's expected in caring for that client. That is negligence. Those four pieces fall under that. Okay, going back up to negligence, from a purely legal standpoint, an injury must occur from that failure in order for it to be negligence. So it's not just that you failed to do it, but that they actually were harmed by that failure. And so then we look at those four pieces together, The first one is, so the 4 pieces that have to come into play for a nurse to be negligent are that nurse had a duty to care for that client. So that's the first piece of it. Meaning that nurse had a legal obligation to take the necessary care actions once that nurse-client relationship had been established. So you are not legally liable to take care of someone unless you have established a nurse-client relationship, right? And that's pretty simple if you're in the hospital and you get to work and you get your patients assigned to you and those are your patients, so your shift ends, right? And that's simple. But what happens when the next person doesn't come in? Or they're 2 hours late? Do you still have a duty to care for those clients? You know, I mean, so there are a lot of gray areas. What happens if there's a fire in the building or there's an active shooter? Or, that's where we get into some ethical dilemmas with nursing and what our duty to care is. You will also have to consider, like, people ask you questions. After your nursing lessons, and maybe they already do this, people and family members will ask you questions when you're not actually at work. And say, hey, look at this bump on the back of my leg, what do you think it is? So when you're offering them advice, you can establish a nurse-client relationship with them outside of work and be responsible for what you've done once you've established that relationship. So, just things to keep in mind. The second piece of that is reasonable care. So a nurse is expected not just to provide care, but to provide a standard of care based on their skill and knowledge. So you're responsible for what you should know as a nurse when you provide care to clients. Breach of duty is when you fail to do that. So it's simply the failure to provide that reasonable standard of care based on your skills and knowledge. And that last concept is proximate cause. And basically what that's saying is, because we talked about that in order to be negligent, there has to be that injury element. So it basically you have to be able to tie that injury to the breach of duty, basically. So you have to be able to prove that injury resulted because the nurse didn't do what they should have done, or the nurse did something that they shouldn't have done, which is another piece of it. It's not just I didn't do it, but maybe I did something that I should have known better than to do, or I did it in a way I should have known better than to do it. And so a lot of proximate cause is also time. Like, did the injury happen within that time period? So that's basically the concept, just tying those things together. So those 4 pieces make up negligence. And these are kind of more separated. Okay, so wait a minute. Stillwater, what is malpractice?
Professional negligence.
Right, basically, yeah. So it is negligence that occurs by a professional. You think about your medical terminology prefixes, what does mal mean? Bad. So basically it's bad practice. So when you as a professional do not practice the way that you should practice, you're guilty of malpractice. Now, how do we know what bad nursing practice looks like? Well, nurses are held to the standards of their profession. And I'm going to try to switch this. I never switch these around. So. Oh, nope, that is probably what I need to do. Okay, so you've got this purple book. Has anybody seen this purple book somewhere in your stuff at some point? And we haven't really looked at that, right? This purple book is basically your contract once you're a nurse with the public. These are the standards that this profession is held to, okay? So, and this book looks really long, but here's what I'm gonna tell you. This back half of it, starting right here, this is just the previous edition of the book. So this whole thing is just the book copied again from the previous edition. So ignore all that, don't mess with that. The first third of it right here is kind of good information. It's explanatory, but it's not the stuff I really, really care about you having to read. It's good when you have a break, but this little bitty bit right in here where it goes over the standards, I do want you to take a look at it this semester. Not necessarily, it's like 30 pages and it's kind of just an outline, so it's not even a ton of reading. And I don't even really want you to do it all at once because you want to absorb it all at once, but just one every week, look at one of these standards, just so that you as a nurse when you graduate know what you're responsible for. Okay, because that's my thing, is if you don't know what your good practice is, what standards you should be held to, you don't know what bad practice or malpractice is either. Okay, so just kind of as you go through the semester, and that's what our in-class activity is going to be over too. But you can also find them online if you don't have it. I mean, you probably don't have to stick with you since you didn't use it last semester, you're not carrying it around. But anyway, so just kind of wanted to show you what was in there and make it a little less overwhelming for you guys to look at, because you really don't need to sit down and read it cover to cover, because I know you don't have time for that. But if you look at those kind of once a week.
What pages is she talking about?
Mrs. Hay?
Yes.
You're asking me what pages you're talking about, and you're kind of talking about the whole book, aren't you?
Well, no, if they will really just, primarily the standards of practice, and I had somebody talk about that same question. Page 53 is where you see the first standard of practice. And then it kind of, make sure I'm not lying to you. Yeah, it's front and back, and then standard 2 starts on the next page, and it's front and a tiny bit on the back. So they really will take you guys 3 minutes or 5 minutes to kind of read and just be aware of. And they finished standard 17 is the last one, and it's on page 84. So you're talking about 30 pages, basically. 53 to 84. Go ahead, here. You didn't get that book? Okay. I don't know, you guys, did it come in a packet from the library or from the bookstore? Oh, the library. Okay. We'll talk about that, because it's not on the optional, it's on the regular list, because I double checked that, so.
Enid students said it was in their box when they bought their.
I'm wondering though about, the person who's asking somebody who wasn't here last semester, so that's what I'm wondering, is if they had a different set for some reason. So we'll work on that, because it is, or you can just borrow one of ours and read it at some point too, just to kind of look at that. And there, I found them online because I kind of was researching for the in-class activity. You can actually kind of find them online too. Okay.
Mrs. Haig,
Yes.
the book was moved from the spring semester to the fall semester for this past year,
Okay.
so that might explain why the student.
Why they're not getting them if they just are started in spring.
Right.
Okay. Okay, yeah, we'll work on that a little bit, or you can just borrow and read it. It's not one we use a ton of, I don't think, this semester. We used to use it for post-conference, but we're not. But yeah, it's just a good thing to kind of look at. But yeah, we'll talk about it later. If you don't have it, get with one of us and we'll get you a copy or something you can look at. Okay, so that's kind of just talking about malpractice. The next one, okay, let me add this one thing. Important to malpractice are some of those standards that come towards the end. You'll see these when you do your activity, have to do with continuing to learn. Nurses are making a commitment to learn for the rest of your life, basically, that you will read and you will learn and you will change your practice based on evidence. Would you want to be cared for by someone who went to school 4 years ago and didn't do anything differently than was done 4 years ago? Obviously not. So you don't want to grow up to be those nurses either, right? So just keep that in mind, that that's kind of the commitment you make to society as a nurse, is that you will continue to learn. Let's see, malpractice. Another concept that goes with malpractice is that it can be passed on to the supervising person. So if you are supervising someone and they are guilty of malpractice, you can also be held responsible for that. So that's an important concept to keep in mind with delegation. On the other hand, if you yourself are responsible of malpractice, who else can they find responsible for that? Anybody know? The facility that you work for, or the people supervising you. So if you do something that you aren't supposed to be doing, or you do it in a way you shouldn't be doing it, they can hold your supervisor and your facility responsible in terms of suing. That concept is where you get the fact that they can sue a hospital for something an individual nurse or physician maybe did, or provider of some sort. So that all comes from that. Next one, duty to warn. So basically, duty to warn means that if a client is deemed to be a threat to the safety of themselves or others, then you need to warn someone. Now where am I at? Enid, what other ethical concept does the duty to warn conflict with as nurses?
Confidentiality.
They said confidentiality.
Exactly. So it's a touchy subject because we as nurses know that we're also responsible for keeping our patients' information confidential. And so it becomes a touchy subject with duty to warn. In some states, nurses can be held liable for civil damages and malpractice if they fail to warn. Does anybody know in Oklahoma, is it one of the 33 states that mandates you to warn people if you know that there's a danger from one of your clients? Tom Larger Church, is it? No, it is not. Oklahoma is a state in which that mandate is permissive, which is kind of the best of both worlds in that it allows you to use your professional judgment. Basically, you can warn if your professional judgment tells you that you need to, but you cannot be held in Oklahoma liable for the fact that you didn't warn if your professional judgment didn't lead you to believe that, basically. Some states you absolutely can be, and so keep in mind when you're taking NCLEX questions and things like that, that's the broad, that's not just for Oklahoma. So typically a nurse is held to have a duty to warn, that if you know that your patient can harm someone, if you have, and there's some criteria, I brought the Oklahoma one with me, it's over there. We'll see if I can also use it on. zoom in. Maybe just the road on the zoom in. Okay, so here's a little bit of a printout of the Oklahoma statute. Okay. Oklahoma statute is that everything is confidential except when the patient is a clear and present danger to himself, or the patient is communicating an explicit threat to kill or inflict serious bodily injury upon a reasonably identified person and has the apparent intent and ability to carry out that threat. And then there's a little bit more stuff. But so the important elements that we see there are that it has to be an explicit threat. You have to be reasonably able to identify the person. So you can't go breaking confidentiality to a whole bunch of people to warn them if you can't reasonably identify who the target of that threat is. The third element that you see there is that they have to have the ability to actually carry that out. So if it's a threat that, you know, I'm gonna blow up something in Paris tonight, that's probably not a reasonable threat if you're in Oklahoma from your client, right? Okay, so keeping in mind that, you know, do they have the means and ability to carry out the threat before you break their confidentiality for it? But I thought that was kind of just some good information for us to have for the area that we practice in. See if this will switch back for us. Okay, so what do if you feel that you need to warn someone? You're basically going to notify your provider, notify others on the healthcare team. You need to know your facility's specific protocols for warning. What is, you know, they may have a specific protocol in place, especially if you're at a mental health facility. And then there are some places will even have an ethics committee that needs to review that situation before confidentiality is breached to confirm that all of those elements are present for that. You're also going to take steps to protect the client, obviously, and anyone that you can in the meantime. The next one is assault. Whose turn is it? Stillwater, what is assault?
Threatening to hurt somebody.
Right, you're exactly right. Assault is the threat itself. So there doesn't actually have to be anything physical that happens. Assault is that feeling of being threatened, that they're going to be mentally or physically harmed. Can you think of a situation where a well-meaning nurse might be guilty of assault? Let's do Enid.
A what? What'd you say?
You guys have any ideas?
Well, I didn't hear the first part. A what nurse?
If a nurse, in a situation that you know of or that might arise when a nurse would be
Threatening and taking their medication.
Yeah.
threatening the patient about taking a medication.
Like not giving them pain, like.
That's exactly a very good example for mental health nursing. You are gonna have situations where a client, and we'll talk more about right to refuse, but basically, unless a client has been found gravely disabled or incapacitated by court, they have the right to refuse their medications. So as a nurse, there's a fine line between, talking to them about why it's a good idea to take their medicines and coercing and threatening them, basically. And so you have to be aware of that. So assault is actually if you threaten the client and say, well, if you don't take your medications, then you're not gonna get to blah, 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 or you're not gonna be, able to, I'm just gonna leave you in here until you take your medicines. Those are actually assaults by a nurse. Because a client, unless they have been found by court to be incapable of making decisions for themselves, even if they were initially admitted involuntarily, still has the right to refuse medication or refuse any kind of treatment. So, and that is one of those things that came to us from common law, from a client suing a facility because they weren't giving them that right. So, and it gets a little, we'll talk about this more, when they go to court and are found incapacitated, basically they're given a guardian. There's another word that our book uses for it too, besides guardian. What is it? No, there's another one now. I'll have to look for my names. We'll get to it again. But anyway, what?
Yeah.
Conservator, that's the word, that's the other word that comes up in our book for it. If they've been given a conservator, basically that right passes on to the conservator. And so basically what we're saying is at that point, once they're found to be incapable of making decisions, then they no longer can make decisions either to consent or refuse a treatment. So basically once that happens, you have to be aware of that with your clients because they can no longer give you consent either. Once they've been found to be incapacitated. All of those decision-making rights and responsibilities fall to whoever's been appointed by the court for them. But up until that point, regardless of how they were admitted, unless there's an immediate threat that you have to deal with in medicating them or restraining them or something, unless they're in immediate danger, they maintain the right to refuse or consent to treatment up until that point. So that's an important kind of area to be aware of. Okay, so next one, battery. So talk about what is battery then? That is an example, yeah, putting in a catheter without consent is an example of battery. It's physical, basically. So it moves beyond just the threat and the physical contact occurs, is when battery occurs.
Mrs. Haig?
Yes.
I had a client, actually, he said, I'm gonna charge you with assault because he was high on meth and he had stabbed himself in the chest and punctured his lungs. So when he relaxed, his O2 sat plummeted and he had oxygen on him, he would take it off. And I pick up the catheter and try to slip it on him while he was asleep. And he said, if you touch me, I'm gonna charge you with assault. I guess he could have charged me with battery. But he actually.
Because it was physical contact too.
He was misinformed. But actually, he shoved me. So when he complained about me to my boss said, well, I think you actually committed battery on our nurse. So it all turned out to be a wash.
Yeah, but it is a good example of like, these are not just things that are written in a textbook that you're not gonna deal with, you are. And one of the points that I was gonna make too is, you may think, I don't care about this topic because I'm not gonna be a mental health nurse, but the thing is, you know what, clients with mental health diagnosis have babies. They have kids who are in the hospital. They have car accidents. They have all of those other things that you're gonna deal with. They have kids who need to come in for well child checks and immunizations. No matter where you go as a nurse, these are concepts that you're gonna have to know, basically, so. Okay, and then the last one on this list is false imprisonment. Stillwater, what is false imprisonment? Right, basically restraint or confinement that is unlawful. So you can be justified to restrain or confine your client if they're a danger immediately, an imminent danger to themselves or others. Beyond that, you cannot restrain or confine your client, basically, because those things are false imprisonment. One of the places that comes up when you're talking about that is if once a client who is voluntarily admitted or a client who was involuntarily admitted and that time period has passed, like their EOD time period has passed, unless they've been incapacitated by the court, they're free to leave your facility. So you have to let them, if you can't just reasonably talk them into it without using threats or coercing them, because that would be assault. And if you block them from departing when they're ready to depart, then that is false imprisonment. You cannot keep them in your facility if they have the right to make that decision to leave and they're trying to leave. So now if you talk to them about the benefits and why it would be good for them to stay, that's fine, unless you're standing blocking the door or physically restraining them while you do it. But you just have to be aware of where that line is, and that a client is not, an important concept to get in your minds is a client does not automatically lose those abilities, those rights to confidentiality, those rights to autonomy, just because they have a mental illness. Unless they're in the imminent danger right that moment, they maintain all of those rights, and we need to be respectful of those. And sometimes that's a hard concept for us when we're looking at someone who we feel like isn't thinking clearly. That doesn't automatically mean that they don't have those rights still. Okay, so some of these slides, like this was nursing implications, we've kind of already talked about those, so we're gonna skip that one. Types of commitment. So we generally think of two types of commitment, voluntary or involuntary. There's also a third type for kind of those people who are incapacitated legally that kind of combines those two things. I mean, they're there involuntarily, but it's not technically involuntary because the person who's responsible for making the decisions has made the decision to put them there. So it kind of falls in between those two. So the first one is voluntary. Actually, most admissions are voluntary admissions. But don't make the mistake of thinking that that's an easy thing. It's not. The clients have to make the decision that they need that kind of help. They have to make arrangements for their work and for their families and to keep their bills paid, and how are they financially going to pay not only for the treatment, but also how are they going to pay their bills and do all the other things that they are committed to while they're in treatment. So keep in mind that just because someone comes in voluntarily, that's not a small thing either. It's still a very difficult decision and a lot of stuff for them to deal with when they're already kind of in a fragile mental health state and not handling things well. It's a lot for them to deal with. Second type is involuntary commitment. Obviously, that's when a person is admitted to the mental health facility without their consent. There are very specific regulations designed to balance the rights of the individual and the rights of society and protection and things like that. So it's very specifically regulated because those things were abused in the past, because people got put in those facilities for long-term care that really didn't belong there necessarily. So we're very careful about when we do that. Typically, the first phase of that is an EOD or emergency detention. A lot of the times it's law enforcement that is first going to encounter them. Somebody's going to call in on them for something, or they're going to threaten somebody, and law enforcement's going to encounter them. In order to meet their qualifications, they have to be, once again, a danger to themselves, danger to others, or gravely disabled. And it's later on in here somewhere that the definition for gravely disabled is basically that they can't provide for their own needs. Basically, they can't find food and shelter and all those things due to their mental illness. Not for other reasons, because they may choose to not do those things, but it's their mental illness that's keeping them from being able to take those basic kind of bottom of the Maslow hierarchy things, take care of themselves. I am definitely not an expert on Oklahoma EOD regulations, so some of you who have worked in Meadow Lake and some places like that are probably gonna know more. And so don't be afraid to speak up if this is kind of your area of expertise. But basically, that initial order can be signed by a law enforcement officer. There's a new mental health company, and I wanna say it's called like Grand Lakes, that is taken over in Stillwater, and in our area I know, and I don't know about Enid. And they have actually done, where they've provided all of the law enforcement officers basically with an iPad. So when they encounter a client, they can actually just kind of stick the iPad in front of them now and get an evaluation like that, which has been hugely helpful to them basically. Like there's a 24-hour service where someone will kind of do a mental health evaluation on that client and give them guidance on whether or not they think an EOD is warranted for them. Those people need to have an initial evaluation within about 12 hours by a healthcare professional. That's one of the regulations of it. I've commonly heard 72 hours is the typical length that someone is EOD for, emergency detained. Actually, when looking, like when in writing, the Oklahoma statute looks to me like it's actually 120 hours or 5 days is actually like in Oklahoma. Typically, it's just the 72 hours that people are usually held for though. But it is an important point because as we move into that next section, so once you get past that initial kind of legal, we can detain someone for this long in an emergency. The next part is a short-term treatment or observation. So it's kind of important that you kind of know where your regulations are, because basically if that EOD expires and you have not gotten a court order to keep them there, you have to let them go unless they are immediately a danger to themselves or others. You know, it's one of those things where all the rules are always out the window if they're immediately a danger to themselves or others. But other than that, you have to be very, very careful with their rights. And once that emergency order detention expires, they can leave if you don't have another court order to hold them for short-term treatment. Or if they may also choose, once they've stabilized, to stay voluntarily and sign themselves in for short-term treatment, and that would work too. Another thing to remember is, according to Oklahoma law, your EOD does not count weekends or holidays. So if somebody gets EOD'd on a Friday, technically the weekends are not part of their 72 or 120 hours. So. Okay, so short term, pretty much what it sounds like. You get to hold them a little longer, treat them a little longer. You either have to have a voluntary consent for that, or you really have to have a court order keeping them there. The next step is long-term commitment. Typically that's people that need to be there greater than 90 days. They're usually stabilized over that short term, and then they have a hearing to keep them in there for long-term commitment. And then that takes you to incapacitated individuals, which is kind of what we talked about a minute ago. Typically, the people who would have a long-term kind of involuntary commitment are going to require some kind of court order that they're gravely disabled or incapacitated, which is basically that they can't provide those basic needs for themselves because of mental illness. Someone else is appointed to make their decisions for them. And so from that point on, that's the person you have to have consent from. Or that is the only person that can refuse treatment to. So. Let's see what else we've already covered some of this stuff. Okay, and then nursing implications, once again, you can skip that next slide because we kind of covered all that as we were talking about them when we did it. Client rights. So some client rights that are specific to mental health nursing. Your client has the right to be treated in the least restrictive environment possible. So that's certainly a right that came from that deinstitutionalization movement. Protects the client's autonomy and freedom. So your treatment should be the least restrictive means possible, and they should be done in the least restrictive environment possible. So if they can be done in an outpatient setting, then they need to be done in an outpatient setting instead of an inpatient setting, things like that. So you give them as much freedom as is safe and possible for their treatments. The next one is confidentiality. And obviously this is important. Disclosure of mental health problems is, a huge sacrifice that the client makes to you. It's a huge thing that you're entrusted with. And so obviously confidentiality is super important in these situations. People maintain their right to that confidentiality regardless of their mental health diagnosis. I thought about that, we talked about in that sexuality lecture about the importance of communicating that to your clients, that basically you can get better information from them if we as a profession are trusted with confidentiality. If we as a nursing profession can't be trusted to keep mental health information confidential, then people are not gonna seek treatment, basically. So that's, individually and as a profession, it's on us to maintain confidentiality for our mental health clients. There are some specific ways it talks about in your book that we do that for people. One of them is that we keep records secure. So when you're like on the units, and you'll probably notice this in St. Anthony's, all the paperwork kind of stays in the nurse's desk, like all that stuff is back there so that it is secure. Be careful about any documentation of information. And then when you disclose information, you have to keep careful records of that. So if you disclose information from someone's mental health record, you need to know what you gave and who you gave it to and when you gave it to them. So that you can carefully track that, because patients maintain when we talk about their HIPAA rights, that's one of their HIPAA rights, is to find out who their information was disclosed to and what information was given to those people. And if the patient doesn't have that HIPAA right anymore, then their conservator holds that right to look for that. So it's careful, you have to keep careful records of that. Be sure that anything you write down is factual and content is appropriate. So be sure, we're not making judgments. We're writing down exactly what happened, supporting it, because that's part of their health record and part of that trust that they placed in us. You need written consent, obviously, to release any kind of information. You're only going to share information with those that need to know. I think sometimes this is especially hard in the mental health setting because the stories get really intriguing and interesting, right? And so, you're going to see things that are just crazy, to you sometimes, like things that you didn't know happen in real life. I mean, I hear that a lot when we go to St. Anthony's, like people come out of the units and they're like, I didn't know, I thought this was just in movies. And so keep in mind that you're going to see stuff that you're going to want to talk about, but that's not fair to those people. And especially in our small communities, let's say if you're at the ER nurse and someone comes in who has a mental health issue. And so they're going to have some strange behaviors in that ER. If you go home and talk about that without using their name or anything else, or if you go to a restaurant and you talk about that, do you think there's a chance someone is going to recognize those behaviors and know exactly who you're talking about because they're unusual behaviors and not everybody has? Absolutely. So in the mental health setting especially, it's very, very important that we are very careful about where we're talking, what we're talking about, and not identifying those people because they have placed that trust in us to care for them and take care of their information. Be sure you verify the identity of any callers wanting information. Be sure you're careful even with faxing and emailing information. Make sure that it's going to be correctly sent via, you've double checked your numbers. You know exactly where it's going to end up. And then it talks about knowing your surroundings. We're going to talk about that. Another place where confidentiality can be an issue is during group therapy. So it's important that you warn your clients. It's important that whenever you're doing group therapy, you talk to your clients about the importance of confidentiality for each other, but then you also warn your clients that you can't guarantee, I can guarantee that I will keep your information confidential as long as it is not something that, is a clear and present threat, and then I will have to share that, and your clients need to know that that's the limit of your confidentiality with them. Be honest with them. If you tell me something, there would be certain things that I would have to pass on if you told me those things, so that they know that. But you also have to let them know that you can't necessarily control what people are going to leave and say after group therapy. So as much as you can try to impress on them the importance of confidentiality for the group, you can't guarantee it in the same way that you should be able to guarantee your own confidentiality. Then the last one on here is HIPAA. Obviously, HIPAA is still going to apply for these clients unless they've been deemed incapacitated, and then those rights go on to their guardian or conservator. Some other HIPAA rights are that they are informed that HIPAA exists. They are informed of their right to confidentiality. They can request a preferred communication method, meaning that they can say, I don't want you to call my home phone, I want you to text me, or I want you, how would they like to receive information to try to protect it. They can always access and review their medical records. They can correct info, and they can approve who it's disclosed to. And then we talked about that. Next. Are we done on time here? We might make it. More client rights, freedom from restraints and seclusion. So once again, in the past, some of those things were overused. We put people in solitary, we physically restrain them for an extended period of time. There's an interesting statistics in your book that the government still estimates that 100 deaths per year are associated with the use of restraints in the US. So basically restraints are dangerous because people can't help themselves, they can't necessarily communicate and things like that. So just as an example, if you had someone restrained so that they couldn't roll over and they got sick and vomited, what would happen?
They'd aspirate.
Yeah, they could aspirate on it. So restraints are a serious matter. Those are reportable deaths, even if the restraints didn't cause them. So if somebody dies in restraints, regardless of whether you think that the restraints caused that death or not, you do have to report those. So those are reportable events. And it wasn't necessarily that we used restraints in the past, even as with ill intent. Typically, we're using them because we're wanting to keep our clients safe. But we really have to be creative and think about other ways if we can keep from restraining them that we do that. Think about what other ways to handle behaviors than just to restrain somebody. Or also seclusion, or to take them away from everybody else all the time, because that isn't really mentally healthy either for them. So that's also not something that we should use as a punishment, is to seclude them. We may have to, once again, in situations where there's an imminent danger and need to, but we don't want that to be our pattern always in dealing with things. One of the things that when I was making this, I was thinking, like, when you're overwhelmed or frightened or angry, think about how you would react to being shut in a room or restrained. Would that help? Would that would that improve the situation? Absolutely not. It's like, what would you want? What would improve the situation? Enid, if you're angry or frustrated, or what do you want?
Somebody to talk to.
Someone said to be left alone, someone else said to be talked to.
Right. No, you're right. It's a very individual thing. That's absolutely true. I think one of the important words also is to be acknowledged. Like, sometimes when we're mad, we just want somebody to say, you know what, I understand why you feel that way. So when we restrain you and we say, well, you shouldn't feel that way, you need to stop doing that, that doesn't necessarily make you feel any better, right? So we need to acknowledge, even if it's a hallucination and we can't see it, we need to acknowledge how frightening it is to that patient. Or if they're afraid of the other clients around them, how frightening that is for them, and acknowledge those feelings. Give them opportunities for physical activity. Maybe walk with them quietly. Talk to them if they want to be talked to. Don't talk to them if they don't want to be talked to. Kind of, let them have some physical activity maybe to try to work off some of that steam. Let them get some space if some space is what they need. Sometimes like a simple activity, maybe like working on a puzzle or something that will distract them, but doesn't require a lot of nothing that would be a competitive activity or things like that, but just like something that will kind of allow them to calm down, can be helpful activities. To try to avoid restraints. As far as sometimes you have this applies to the hospital too, confused patients who want to climb out of bed. So, we've gone to using more bed alarms rather than restraining them. That's one of the ways we reduce restraints, is to find other ways of observing them than restraining them. In the hospital, sometimes 24-hour sitters, we put them under observation maybe rather than restraining them, is have somebody really just physically there watching them rather than keeping them restrained. Rules when we do use restraints. Talk law. Give me some rules for when we do use restraints. Slip knots so we can get them off easily. I heard a lot. Give me one. Yeah, you do need an order for them. You can put them on an emergency, but you need an order within an hour. That your order needs to indicate the type of restraint, the reason you're restraining them, and how long you can keep them restrained. It can't just be an order for, you can put them on until you feel like taking them off. It's a specific order that would have to be renewed, and you need to be able to document it. Even if, and we'll talk about this later, even if you're giving them a consequence that they can't, or they can't go to an activity, in mental health nursing, you're also gonna have to document, why did you do that? Because you don't want to be secluding them or punishing them, so why did I make this choice? Why did I not allow them to go to group time at the gym? What was my reason behind that? So be sure you're always documenting those things. Those are good. What else we got? How often do I need to take them off? We need to check them every 15 minutes, so that's a good number. Check them for safety and comfort needs. Maybe they need to go to the bathroom. Do they need a drink? Because they can't do those things for themselves now. We need to take them off every 2 hours, basically. And then we need to reassess at that point whether they still need them. Have they calmed down to the point where we don't need to put them back on right now? One thing that's important before you take them off is that you communicate what the expected behaviors are when you remove them. So I'm gonna remove your restraints now, so you can get up and walk around for a minute. Here's what I need from you, and maybe we won't have to put it back on. If you can do these things, or you'll need to stay back this far, you need to keep your hands where I can see them, you need to stay in this room, whatever those requirements are for your facility, be sure you communicate them so the client knows what the expectations are when you remove the restraints. We all do better when we know what to expect, right? It's always, if we don't. Let's see, staff needs to be properly trained. We need to document that we've tried alternatives, that we tried other things before we restrain that client, unless it's obviously, one of the dangerous situations where we had to do it immediately. Other than that, we need documentation for why we did it. We still would need documentation for why we did it, I guess. You may need to notify family or others as according to their chart. You may need to notify someone that they've been restrained, that you had to take these actions and why, and then that they're tracking it. And then we kind of already talked about suspension of rights. The last one, there's the right to consent, or the middle one, there's the right to consent or refuse treatment. So we kind of already talked about those. Obviously, that's a yes on your voluntary admissions. If they're involuntary admitted, can they